everybody. This video is on the Rhineland Mystics. So let's start with who exactly are the Rhineland Mystics? Typically, the term refers to the three Dominicans, Meister Eckhart, John Tauler, and Henry Suso. And I'm going to talk about all three of them. But I'm also including Gertrude the Great in this video as well, because she was a German mystic who lived at the same time. She's like 4 years older than Meister Eckhart. So she's operating in the same time and space as the Rhineland Mystics. So let's start with Gertrude, since she's the oldest, and then we'll move into the three Dominicans. Like Hildegard of Bingen, Gertrude was a Benedictine, though her convent was actually heavily influenced by Cistercians and their spiritual needs, you know, priests coming to say the Mass, give communion, things like that, was actually met by the Dominicans. So there's some different monastic influences going on in Gertrude's life. So things get a little wild here in the Middle Ages with all the different orders. Anyway, Gertrude is really one of the great minds of the Middle Ages, though we don't have a ton of biographical information on her. We do know that she came to Helfta, which was a very famous and well-renowned convent in Germany, as a young child. She was like 4 or 5, somewhere in there. What's really interesting is there aren't any records of who her family was, which has made me wonder if maybe she was, you know, the natural child of like an aristocrat or possibly even a royal. We just don't know. And it's strange that there's just no indication of who her family is. Okay. Anyway, during this time, Helfta was very, very much a center of learning. In fact, there are a number of other well-known nuns that lived at Helfta, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, Gertrude of Hackburn. So you're seeing a lot of kind of intellectual writings coming out of this place. Gertrude, she got an unusually high level of education for a girl. The nuns kind of saw how intellectually gifted she was, and they really gave her a solid education. She knew Latin, she knew the scriptures, she knew the church fathers, she knew contemporary theologians. She knew Bernard well, his works well, and he was particularly influential on her. At the age of 25, though, she has a mystical experience. And I have it up on the screen because I don't have you reading it, and it's interesting for a number of reasons. So I'll read it for you. I looked up and saw before me a youth of about 16 years of age, handsome and gracious. Young as I was then, the beauty of his form was all that I could have desired, entirely pleasing to the outward eye. Courteously and in a gentle voice, he said to me, "Soon will come your salvation. Why are you so sad? It is because you have no one to confide that you are sorrowful." Then later she continues on, "I heard these words, 'I will save you, I will deliver you, do not fear.' With this I saw his hand, tender and fine, holding mine as though to plight a troth, and he added, 'With my enemies you have licked the dust and sucked honey from thorns. Come back to me now, and I will inebriate you with the torrents of my divine pleasure.'" All right, so of a particular note here in this quote is the use of bridal imagery, right? This is common in the mystical literature of the era. It's a great example of it. Gertrude uses erotic language here, not necessarily to sexualize her relationship with God, but to demonstrate a very deep intimacy between her and Christ. A few things to note here. This is the moment that Gertrude understood to be her conversion. Keep in mind, she was actually already a nun and had been living in a convent since she was 4 years old. She also wrote that she constantly felt Christ's presence within her from that day forward. We know that she became a very sought-after spiritual advisor to both nuns living within the convent, but also from other people living in the outside world. She had contact with people. She was also a writer, completing spiritual works and explanations on the scriptures, interestingly enough. We only have 2 extant works from her, and those are the Herald of Divine Love and her Spiritual Exercises. The Herald of Divine Love is actually her book of Revelations. But it is her spiritual exercises that's really the more enjoyable work, and that has been pretty popular. It's a collection of meditations, prayers, chants, hymns, and litanies. The prayer of the week for our class is from her spiritual exercises. I had really seriously debated having you read the whole thing, but our medieval week was already so packed, I didn't think I could add another book in. So Gertrude died in November of either 1301 or 1302. And for a time, she actually kind of passed into obscurity. But then a Latin edition of her work was published in 1536, which is interesting, like right in the midst of the Protestant Reformation. And this brought a real renewed fame to this medieval mystic. She was never formally canonized, but she was given a feast day in the early 17th century, which is still celebrated on November 16th. And the title the Great was given to her to distinguish her both from Gertrude of Hackburn, who also lived at Helfta, and to recognize kind of the depth and importance of her theological work. All right, let's look at Meister Eckhart now, who, as I said, was only 3 or 4 years younger than Gertrude. So there's this really interesting phenomenon with Eckhart. He has both been surrounded by a cloud of suspicion due to the heresy accusations and trials that was held within his life, but he also seems to be one of the most popular mystics, especially with Protestants. And I have some theories about why, but I can come back to that. So he is the founder of the so-called Rhineland Mystics. And this, of course, includes Tauler and Suso. This group tended to write in German, not Latin. Actually, Eckhart wrote his very serious theological works were in Latin, but then his more pietistic, lay-focused writings were in German. Okay, whereas Tauler and Suso were more in German. As far as his life, there are some huge holes in Eckhart's biography. In fact, the first solid information we actually have on him is his appointment to the University of Paris in the year 1294. He taught theology there. In fact, he had 2 appointments at the University of Paris. The only other person to have that honor was actually Thomas Aquinas. So that shows you kind of how well renowned of a theologian Eckhart was during his lifetime. Eckhart was German. He was probably from the state of Thuringia, probably the son of a knight like Bernard. After his time at Paris, he took a position as the head of the Dominican order in Saxony. He later served as the vicar for the Master General of the entire Dominican order, and that was located in Strasbourg. There, he connected with a number of different women's monastic houses. He was influenced by both nuns and Beguines, and then he also preached to both, nuns and Beguines. It was later in life that we get these accusations of heresy coming out against him. He had a really interesting response to the charges. He said that he could be in error because that was of the intellect, but not a heretic because heresy belongs to the will. He ended up in Rome on trial, but he died before the trial ended. After his death, though, the Pope issued a bull listing 28 points in which his theology was condemned. However, Eckhart did die in communion with the church because he confessed to his errors. And it was his teachings that were condemned, not Eckhart himself, which is actually a pretty important distinction. Okay. That said, this trial has kind of long marred his legacy. I'm not going to go into all the issues of this. I'm going to talk about kind of 2 different things. The one thing of note is his concept of mystical union, which is very much a loss of self when joining with God. Another thing is that he talks about God as the ground of being, which is another aspect of theology that has kind of caused some suspicion for some folks, but has also made him really appealing to modern theologians. Another interesting thing that happens sometimes in kind of modern interpretation of Eckhart is a desire to almost turn him into a Buddhist monk. I've seen this numerous times. And I think it's because Eckhart is so embedded in that negative understanding of God, and he has this emphasis on detachment. Many folks just don't know that there is a genuine tradition of this dating back to the early church. And frankly, modern American Christianity really isn't much like this at all. So when people look at his theology, I think Buddhism seems like more of a match than the Christian tradition, even though there really is Christian theology that is underpinning him. And I think his theology does come together in a rather unique way. But I mean, he held these prominent teaching positions at Paris. He was a highly respected theologian. The heresy trials came very late in life. And there is a genuine argument today that folks were interpreting him wrong, that the charges were more politically based and actually theologically based. So I do not consider him a heretic by any means, though he does push the envelope, especially within kind of that medieval mindset, that medieval context that he is operating in. But also remember, Abelard and Aquinas both dealt with heresy accusations too. So it could be a rough time to be a theologian. All right, enough on Eckhart. Let's just briefly talk about Tauler and Suso. All right, so up on the screen, I have an image of both. Suso is in the painting, Tauler is the statue. Once in a while, I come across things that surprise even me in history, and this Suso image is one of them. I found it, I thought it seemed like a nice painting, and then I noticed that he was lifting up his shirt and pointing to something with a stylus. A stylus was this like a medieval tool to write on like wax tablets. Okay. It took me a little time to figure out what was going on in this image. Whenever you have something like this in paintings of the saints, there's got to be a reason behind it. So I did a little research. Eventually I found the Life of the Blessed Henry Suso written by himself. And in the 5th chapter, I read about how he decided to carve the name of Jesus with a stylus into his own skin. So yeah, he had a tendency towards asceticism and self-harm, to say the least. All right, a little bit about these guys. It is likely that both Suso and Tauler trained under Eckhart. They certainly were influenced by him regardless. They were both Dominicans, like Eckhart. I have 2 short videos up about these two, so I'm going to make this brief. The video on Suso is by a Dominican friar who talks a little bit about his life, but also the main focus of the video is Suso's kind of poetry, his music, and you can hear a carol that Suso wrote in the video. It's quite nice. I thought it was pretty interesting. It's just under 4 minutes long, and then the one on Tauler talks about his life and influence, and I especially like it because it's coming from a Lutheran perspective. You can see how much these Rhineland Mystics indeed influenced Martin Luther, and Tauler in particular, it did indeed influence Luther. Both of these men were associated with the Friends of God, which was a group that was focused on personal piety and included both clergy and lay members. I'm just going to give you a little bit of bio here. Suso first. The basics of his life are that he was born into a military family, but he ended up being a friar and a poet. Apparently, he was quite a disappointment to his family. He becomes a Dominican friar, and like any good Dominican, he traveled around preaching, he heard confessions, and he wrote this incredibly popular book called The Little Book of Eternal Wisdom. And this is one of the most popular books in the Middle Ages. So while he's probably the least known of the Rhineland Mystics today, he was very well known and very important within his lifetime. Tauler, however, is probably the best known of all the Rhineland Mystics. He is slightly younger than Suso. He was a Dominican priest from Strasbourg. He was a gifted preacher, and that is why you are reading a sermon for this class. We do know that Tauler influenced Luther, and so he is one of the mystics that tends to be pretty well read by Protestants. I find his work incredibly beautiful. His sermons are just lovely. Of all the Rhineland mystics, he's actually my favorite. Because he is so well known and was so well known during his lifetime, there's a lot of writings that were attributed to him. such as actually the Theologica Germanica. But now scholars are sure he didn't write that one. And a number of these other writings that were attributed to him have kind of been debunked. But the sermon you're reading is written by him, okay? Speaking of the Theologica Germanica, I did put it up in the Moodle page. It's long. I don't expect you to read it all. But again, this is a mystical text that influenced Luther quite a bit, and you might be interested just to take a look at it. All right. Thanks, everybody.